You were standing right there, surrounded by people, voices, laughter, bodies filling every corner of the room. A party, a workplace, a family gathering, a train full of strangers, a table full of friends. And somewhere inside you, quiet as a tide going out, came the sensation that you were the only one actually here. Not in the romantic sense, not the poetic aloneness of the philosopher or the misunderstood genius. Something more intimate and more disturbing. The sudden cellular knowledge that the level at which you are perceiving the world is not the level at which anyone else in this room is operating. That you can hear a frequency no one else is hearing. That you are attending a different event than the one everyone else is attending. One that takes place entirely inside, where the real conversations happen and the real silences live. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the distance between people. Not the physical distance, the psychic distance. The gap between what one human being experiences as reality and what another one does. He called it the difference between psychological types, and his entire typological model was, at its root, an attempt to answer a question that most people don't even know they're asking. Why does the person beside me, breathing the same air, hearing the same words, experience an entirely different interior event than I do? For the empath, that question is not academic. It is the daily architecture of their loneliness. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." That sentence deserves to be read more than once, because it identifies, with surgical precision, the nature of the empath's isolation. Not absence of company, absence of recognition. Not absence of relationships, absence of depth in those relationships that matches the depth at which the empath is actually living. In the next 25 minutes, we move through 4 layers of this isolation, not to explain it away, but to trace it to its roots. To show you what is structurally happening in the empath's psyche when they stand in a crowd and feel more alone than they ever feel in an empty room. And to arrive at the place where that aloneness transforms from a wound into a beginning. Now let's go into the crowd and into the silence at its center. There is a concept in acoustic engineering called the infrasonic threshold, the frequency below which human hearing officially ends, and yet the body continues to register vibration. People standing in rooms with infrasonic frequencies report unease, anxiety, the sense that something is present but cannot be identified. They feel before they understand. They register before they know. The empath lives permanently below the threshold of common emotional frequency. This is not a metaphor dressed in scientific clothing. It is a precise description of what Jungian psychology identifies as a fundamentally different orientation of the feeling function. One of Jung's 4 cognitive functions, alongside thinking, sensation, and intuition. In most people, the feeling function operates as an evaluative tool. This is good, this is bad, I like this, I don't. It makes qualitative judgments, it assigns value, it helps the ego decide how to orient itself relative to what is being experienced. In the deeply sensitive person, the feeling function does all of that, and then continues downward. It doesn't stop at evaluation, it descends into the emotional substrate of the situation itself. It registers not only the surface of what is happening, but the underlying causes, the historical residue, the unresolved tensions, the things that are being actively suppressed or denied. It reads the room at a depth that the room itself is unaware of. This is why the empath feels alone in a crowd. Not because no one is there, because the crowd is operating at a perceptual level that the empath left behind long ago. And the things the empath is perceiving, the things that are most vivid and most urgent to their interior experience, are invisible to everyone around them. It is like standing in a museum with someone who cannot see the paintings. The walls are not empty. The person standing beside you simply cannot see what is hanging on them. Jung described this as the inevitable tension between what he called the differentiated function and the collective norm. Every person who has a highly developed psychological function, whether thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition, exists in a state of partial exile from the collective, because their perception outpaces the collective's shared perceptual bandwidth. The highly differentiated thinker thinks thoughts that most people cannot follow. The The highly differentiated intuitive sees patterns that most people will not recognize for years. And the highly differentiated feeler, the empath, feels realities that the people around them have not yet registered and may never. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." This is not a platitude. It is a structural observation about the incommensurability of interior experience between different psychological types. The empath does not merely have more feelings than other people. They have a qualitatively different relationship with emotional reality. They inhabit it the way a deep-sea diver inhabits water, not passing through it, but immersed in it, subject to its pressures, seeing things at its depths that no one on the surface can see. The philosophical dimension of this is both liberating and sobering. Liberating because it means the loneliness is not a flaw. It is not the result of social failure, of being too strange, of not trying hard enough to connect. It is a structural consequence of perceiving at a depth that the collective emotional frequency cannot match. Sobering because it means the loneliness cannot be fully solved by finding more people. It can only be metabolized, turned into something the empath understands about themselves and integrates into the fabric of their self-concept, rather than something they endlessly attempt to escape through connection that, by structural definition, cannot quite reach them. You are not alone because no one is there. You are alone because you hear the notes between the notes, and no one else hears the music. Here is something the empath rarely suspects about their own social behavior. The version of themselves they bring to social situations is often the exact mechanism that prevents genuine connection from ever occurring. This requires unpacking. Jung's concept of the persona, the social mask, the adapted self, the version of us that emerges in response to environmental expectations, is usually discussed as a universal psychological feature. Everyone has a persona. Everyone modulates their behavior based on context. The persona is not inherently pathological, it is adaptive. It allows the individual to function socially without exposing the full complexity of their interior at every moment. But the empath's persona has a specific, unusual, and deeply costly feature. The empath's persona is not merely adaptive, it is reactive to the emotional needs of the environment. Most people's personas are relatively stable, a consistent social self that adjusts at the margins. The empath's persona shifts radically and continuously, recalibrating in real time to whatever the surrounding emotional field requires. In a room of anxious people, the empath's persona becomes calming. In the presence of grief, it becomes steady and absorptive. Around someone in need of being seen, the empath's persona becomes a mirror, reflecting back exactly what the other person needs to recognize in themselves. This is why people are so drawn to empaths, why they feel so seen in their presence, why they instinctively seek them out in moments of emotional complexity. The empath's persona is, in a sense, built for the other person. And this is exactly where the loneliness deepens. Because a persona built for the other person does not represent the self. It represents a function, a service, that the empath provides. And the connection that forms around this service, however warm and authentic it may feel, is a connection between the other person and the empath's persona, not between the other person and the empath's actual interior. The empath is seen, but only the mask is seen. The empath is valued, but for what they provide, not for who they are when they are not providing anything. This dynamic creates an agonizing paradox. The empath is surrounded by people who feel deeply connected to them, while the empath themselves feels deeply unconnected to anyone. Because at no point in the interaction was the empath's own interior the subject. At no point was the empath received rather than receiving. At no point did the other person encounter the strange, complicated, sometimes dark, sometimes demanding, sometimes needy actual human being behind the responsive, adaptive, exquisitely calibrated social mask. Jung wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual." For most people, the concealment is partial and strategic. For the empath, it is comprehensive and habitual. The true nature of the individual is not merely concealed, It has been so thoroughly subordinated to the reactive persona that the empath themselves may have difficulty accessing it without the presence of another person's emotional field to organize around. This is the heart of the persona trap. The empath who has never examined the distinction between their adaptive social self and their actual interior self will continue to enter social situations, provide extraordinary emotional attunement, leave feeling unmet, and interpret this as evidence that connection at their depth is impossible. When in fact the issue is not the depth of the connection available, it is that the empath has never offered the material that genuine connection at their depth would require. They have offered the persona. They have offered the service. They have offered the mirror. They have not offered the face behind the mirror. The version of you that makes everyone feel seen is the same version that ensures no one sees you. Let's shift from the personal to something larger. There is a dimension of the empath's loneliness in crowds that cannot be explained by personal history alone. Something that operates at a level beneath the individual psyche, in the territory Jung called the collective unconscious. And what this dimension reveals is not about you specifically. It is about what the crowd itself actually is, beneath its surface of individual faces and separate conversations. Jung spent years studying mass psychology, not the superficial observation that people behave differently in groups, which was already understood, but the deeper question of why. What happens to the individual psyche when it enters a collective field? What is activated? What is suppressed? What rises from beneath the threshold of individual consciousness when the containing structure of the group replaces the containing structure of the self? His findings were not reassuring. Jung observed that the collective field tends to activate the lower layers of the psyche, the more primitive, less differentiated, more emotionally volatile layers that are normally held in check by the individual's ego structure. In a group, the individual's ego partially dissolves into the group mind, and the emotional register of the group descends toward what Jung called the archaic level, a layer of psychic functioning that is older, less rational, more susceptible to contagion, and more emotionally raw. Most people experience this descent as energizing. The loss of individual boundary feels like connection. The activation of the lower psychic layers feels like vitality, like excitement, like belonging. The football stadium, the concert, the political rally. These environments work precisely by facilitating the descent of individual consciousness into the collective emotional field. The empath experiences this descent differently. Not as energizing, but as overwhelming. Not as connection, but as invasion. Because the empath's already permeable psychic boundary, which in one-to-one situations can be managed with effort, is completely outmatched by the sheer volume and intensity of the collective emotional field. Where most people's ego boundaries are slightly softened by the crowd, the empath's boundaries dissolve entirely. They do not join the collective field, they are absorbed by it. They do not feel the crowd's energy as something alongside their own, they feel it as their own, without the ability to distinguish between the two. Jung wrote, "The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes." For the empath, this is not just a philosophical observation, it is a daily lived experience of psychic erasure. They walk into the crowd and within minutes, sometimes seconds, their own interior is no longer accessible. It has been flooded by the combined emotional content of every person in proximity. The anxiety of the stranger 2 rows ahead, the grief of the woman by the window, the suppressed rage of the man on his phone. None of it identified, all of it present, all of it pressing against the empath's interior with the weight of its collective demand to be felt. This is why the empath feels most alone in a crowd, not despite the people, because of them. Because the crowd creates a condition in which the empath's self, the actual, located individual self that would need to be present for genuine connection to occur, is temporarily lost. Overwhelmed not by indifference but by the raw volume of what they are receiving. They are not ignored by the crowd. They are, in a terrifyingly literal sense, consumed by it. And in that consumption, the loneliness is not the loneliness of absence. It is the loneliness of having been lost, of standing in the center of a human field so dense with emotional content that the one emotional reality they cannot locate is their own. The philosophical dimension here touches something Jung considered central to the modern crisis: the tension between individuality and collectivity. The empath embodies this tension more intensely than almost anyone else. Their gift is connection, and that gift, when applied to the collective field without sufficient protection, becomes the instrument of their own disappearance. The crowd does not exclude you, it overwrites you. Everything we have explored points to a single conclusion that most empaths resist with every fiber of their being. The aloneness is necessary, not as punishment, not as the price of being different, not as evidence that connection at the depth the empath requires is impossible or reserved for other people. Necessary as a structural condition of a psyche that perceives at the depth that it does. Necessary the way silence is necessary for music, not as the absence of sound, but as the space that gives sound its shape and meaning. Jung arrived at this understanding through his own experience. After his break with Freud, he entered a period of profound isolation that lasted years, what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. During that period, he deliberately withdrew from the collective psychological field and turned inward, engaging the images, voices, and figures that arose from his own depths through the practice of active imagination. The result was not permanent isolation. It was the development of an interior life so rich, so articulated, so genuinely inhabited that when he returned to the world, he returned as someone who could connect from a place of genuine self-possession rather than from the chronic, diffuse, boundaryless openness that had characterized his earlier engagement with others. This is the model for the empath's transformation, not from lonely to connected, but from unconsciously lonely to consciously alone. And from that conscious aloneness, paradoxically, to a quality of connection that the unconscious loneliness could never produce. The distinction matters enormously. The unconsciously lonely empath walks into the crowd and is overwhelmed. Their persona activates, their boundaries dissolve. They give, absorb, mirror, translate, and leave feeling unseen. This is the cycle that many empaths have been repeating for decades. The consciously alone empath walks into the same crowd from a different foundation. They have done the interior work, the morning practice, the midday clearing, the evening return, the sustained engagement with their own depths that gives them access to their own interior even in the presence of the collective field. They still feel everything. The frequencies have not changed, but they have a reference point, a home ground, a place inside from which they can observe what they are receiving without being consumed by it. And from that place, something unexpected becomes possible. Selective, genuine, depth-appropriate connection. Not the indiscriminate emotional flooding of the unprotected empath, not the persona-driven service of the reactive social self, but the conscious, chosen act of turning toward another person from a place of genuine self-presence and saying, not in words, but in the quality of their attention, I am here, I can see you, and I am still myself while I do. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The empath who has learned to be consciously alone enters that meeting as a full substance rather than a dissolved one. The reaction is genuine. The transformation is mutual. The connection occurs at the depth the empath has always craved, not because they finally found someone who operates at their frequency, though that happens sometimes, but because they have finally made themselves available for connection at their own depth. They have stopped performing the persona. They have stopped absorbing the field. They have offered instead their actual interior, strange, deep, sometimes dark, sometimes overwhelming, always real, and allowed the other person to meet it or not. This is how aloneness becomes the foundation of connection, not its enemy, not its opposite, its prerequisite. The empath who has never sat with their aloneness, who has always run from it into the crowd, into the next relationship, into the next person who needs them, has never given themselves the chance to discover what they actually contain. And what they contain, when they finally turn toward it with honest curiosity, is not emptiness. It is the very substance that genuine connection requires. The empath's aloneness is not a symptom, it is an invitation, the most important one they will ever receive. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to become someone worth being understood by, and to find the ones who can. There is a quality of quiet that comes after genuine understanding, not the quiet of resignation, So this is my life, alone at a frequency no one else hears. That's not understanding. That's still the wound talking. The quiet, I mean, is different. It is the settled, clear, almost warm stillness that arrives when you stop interpreting your aloneness as failure and begin to see it as architecture, as the necessary interior space that allows you to contain what you contain, to perceive what you perceive, to be, in the fullest sense, what you are. Jung spent the last portion of his life at Bollingen, a stone tower he built with his own hands on the shore of a Swiss lake. He went there not to hide, but to be fully himself, in a way that the social world, with all its demands and performances and collective emotional noise, did not allow. He carved inscriptions into the stone. He painted on the walls. He wrote some of the most important psychological texts of the 20th century from that solitary tower, not despite the aloneness, but within it, nourished by it, made possible by it. Your aloneness is not Bollingen, but it serves the same function. It is the place, not a location, but a quality of interior presence where you are not performing for anyone, not absorbing from anyone, not calibrating to anyone, where you are simply, fully, undefendedly yourself. And from that place, everything else becomes possible. Connection becomes possible, real connection, at the depth you've always needed. Creativity becomes possible, because the interior is no longer occupied by other people's material. Rest becomes possible, because the psyche finally has space in which nothing is being demanded of it. This is not a cure for the loneliness. It is something better. It is the transformation of the loneliness into the most generative, the most honest, and the most alive version of solitude. The solitude that produces not isolation, but depth. And from that depth, the connections that do come, the rare ones, the ones that match your frequency, the ones that can meet you where you actually live, arrive not as rescue, but as recognition. Two people standing in the same music, hearing the same notes between the notes, and knowing, for once, that they are not alone. If this resonated, truly, in the place beneath the words, subscribe. This channel exists for the ones who hear that frequency, the ones who have been standing in the crowd, feeling everything, wondering where home is. Home is inside. It always was.